This is Dialogue, a weekly conversation where creativity meets technology. This episode of Season 1 is brought to you by Luna Display and Working Copy. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Okay, Federico, I want to dive right back in where we left off with John Gruber. Let's get going, and I'll let you start off with the first question.
I realize that this is such a complex question, but in the context of wanting to have a bigger community of, people writing and sharing ideas and opinions about Apple and about technology, is there any kind of advice that you would give to somebody who's trying to do what you've been doing? Would you still suggest create your own blog and write, or would you say maybe these days it's better if you go to YouTube or something like that? Would you still argue in favor of having, your own indie presence, your own blog, your own domain name? Or would you say, yeah, maybe it's better if you tried some other way, some other social channel, or maybe video, or maybe a podcast?
Well, you could do all of it, right? I mean, I don't do much on YouTube. I think I've only got like 2 YouTubes on my account. And one of them is my live podcast, just on video format. But maybe I will. I mean, in terms of what might I do differently in the next few years than what I've been doing, doing more stuff on YouTube is certainly on the table, just because, that's which way the wind is flowing. But I would find it terrifying. I worry all the time about Daring Fireball and podcasting. I think if you're not worried, you're not paying it. You're not doing a good job to your business. I mean, I'm sure Tim Cook worries about Apple's ability to sell anything. I mean, if you're not worried about your business, then I don't think you're a good business person. So I worry about the continuing ability to sell weekly sponsorships. I mean, I've peaked at the rate that I can sell them at years ago. And they seem to be slightly harder to sell now than they were years ago. And it's not because Daring Fireball is less popular, but I think it is even at my little fringe domain at the edge of the galaxy, the growing dominance of Facebook and Google as the funnel through which all online advertising gets spent is reached even me. I mean, it killed the deck. I mean, it absolutely killed the deck, which was the ad network I was a part of, which is a bunch of indie sites like Daring Fireball, that Jim Kudal at Kudal.com started back in 2006 or so. The deck was a little too reliant on bigger advertisers to reach the whole network, and those bigger advertisers really just no longer had a budget after they spent what they were spending on Facebook and Google. And were also at the same time, decisions were being made by the people with those budgets to want advertising venues with incredibly intrusive ad tech tracking stuff, which the deck refused to participate in. So I worry about that. I worry about podcasting, even though podcasting for me is still growing a little bit. It's at least 50%, probably more than 50% of the revenue that my site generates now, which is odd for me because I still feel like a writer who podcasts, not a writer/podcaster.
Yeah.
So I think you should. My first part of my advice for someone who wants to get into it and get started is to don't think it has to be either or. Keep your options open, and always be flexible. But I would definitely recommend starting your own site. I still would. The other factor of that, though, is to recognize that you may have to go for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and keep going and without really making any money before you kind of grow to the point where you might make money. Like, don't underestimate or give up how much work you might have to put into it before it gets off the ground.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I started Mac Stories 7 years after Daring Fireball in 2009, and I basically ran it for free for the first year, just because I had savings from my first job. I used to sell. It was a weird concept, but I used to work in an eBay store. So the idea would be that people would come in and bring you their stuff to sell on eBay.
They're junk, right?
Yes. And I had savings from that. So, everybody who asked me, were you making money right away? And the answer is no, which sort of ties back to the idea of that was, the privilege of being able to do this because you had savings from a previous job, because you were able to have a job before, and it's a whole discussion. But before we move on to the more, the technical stuff and sort of the stylistic stuff, the writing process, would you say that are you more concerned with the business side, or do you ever think about the idea of maybe, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, that people will no longer pay attention to what you have to say? That, the idea of with age, or maybe due to other circumstances, maybe, what we do becomes irrelevant and what we think becomes irrelevant. Is that something that you try not to think about too much, maybe, or is it something that you keep an eye on, sort of try and keep a fresh mindset? What's your take on this?
I worry about it, but I don't know how to predict it. All I know is to write what I've always said that both, on the podcast and especially on the writing, is my ideal reader and / listener is a second version of me personally, who just, if there was another version of me who just never, some twist of fate, wasn't writing Daring Fireball, but was out there, but loved reading blogs, that Daring Fireball would be his favorite. That's who I write for. And it served me well so far. And I don't know, I don't know how applicable that is to the overall Daring Fireball readership in terms of the appeal. But I at least know that 10, 15 years from now, I could still write what that alternate version of me who's a reader would still be most interested in and wouldn't want to miss. I'm concerned about it, of course, but I don't know what else I can do other than to just, I'm not trying to hit some arbitrary imaginary target. I know exactly who I want to be reading the site, and I know I can keep hitting that. What was the other half of the question? There was another half of that question.
I think I forgot about it. No, that's a very good answer, though. Because I see people. Here's my not a problem, but something that I notice. People sort of trying to force themselves to get into something new because they feel like it's the right horse to bet on for the future. So maybe. I don't know. I wrote about the Mac for 10 years. Now I'm going to force myself to be all about the Apple Watch. Right. And sort of, and you can tell that coverage doesn't necessarily seem honest, in the sense of you can tell that those people, they're not excited about writing that stuff. I don't know how to put it, but the idea of, maybe the Mac is not going to be super important, or it doesn't have to be the Mac, but anything else, but any topic, and sort of trying to force yourself to be someone else. And I think your answer is pretty much the way that I see it. It's impossible to predict. I'm just going to stay true to myself and the kind of people that I want to write for. And then whatever happens, happens. If maybe 20 years from now, nobody listens anymore, well, at least I got a career of 30 years. So, yeah. It's a very good answer. I forgot what I was going with my question, but that pretty much is, yeah.
Yeah, no, I know where you're coming from, Federico, because, when you think about it, there's this weird tension where you have something that you know really well, and maybe this kind of goes back to what I asked John about earlier, which is, you write what you know, but if you only write what you know, you also kind of end up kind of forming this particular bubble for yourself that defines who you are and what you're able to write about. And how do you break out of that? And should you break out of that? And how do you expand that? And, I think that probably that sphere of what you write about works better when you grow it organically, as opposed to trying to force it where you say, okay, well, the Apple Watch is big now, so I'm now the Apple Watch guy. That's I think what you're getting at, is that's just not pushing that and forcing it never comes across as authentic.
Yeah, I agree with that. The other half of your question, I think, was something about advice for people wanting to get into it.
Yes.
And yeah. I will say, just start your own thing. And the main reason is that the one thing you can build up there, even if you're not accumulating money, is you're accumulating a reputation. Right. And nobody can take that away from you. And it has a tremendous amount of value. I've left in the short run a tremendous amount of money on the table at Daring Fireball over the years. Not in recent years so much, because in the modern era where Facebook and Google so dominate, but in like the 2006, 7, 8 era, I had a lot of offers from ad networks to leave the deck for a lot more money than what the deck was paying. But they were ads that at a technical and aesthetic level, I never really even considered it. Never really. I mean, I listened to offers, but never really had like hey, I better, talk with my wife over dinner and evaluate this. I never really even considered it. In fact, I avoided talking with her about it so that she wouldn't hear how much bigger the numbers were. But my justification for it, even as at a business sense, not at an emotional sense, was that by avoiding these ads that I thought were aesthetically displeasing, technically displeasing in terms of being in the early days of JavaScript being part of the ad payload, in addition to just text and images, was that it was an investment in the brand that would pay off in the long run. And I think in hindsight, I was right. And I think even if you're not taking ads at all, if you're an up and coming writer who wants to make a name for themselves, doing it on your own site and having control over everything and being able to write exactly what you want to write is a good way to build up brand equity just in your own name as a writer.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by our friends at Luna Display. Having extra space when you're working on your Mac is incredibly useful, but not all of us have 2 displays, and that's where Luna Display comes in. With a tiny bit of hardware, you can transform an iPad into a second Retina display for your Mac. Just pop in a little bit of hardware into a USB-C or mini display port, and just like that, you've got a second display with crystal clear image quality, reliable performance, and wireless flexibility all in one. Luna Display works seamlessly over Wi-Fi, but if for some reason you don't have Wi-Fi, you can use a USB cable too. And the great thing about Luna Display is how portable the setup is. Luna is a great way to remain productive, whether you're in the office, at home, or on the go. But what's really amazing is that Luna acts as a complete extension of your Mac. It's going to work with your external keyboard and with your Apple Pencil, as well as touch interaction. That means you can use your finger to interact with your Mac, which is super cool. On top of that, the all-new Liquid video engine is super fast, and there's virtually no lag, and the screen refresh rate is incredibly fast. I want to tell you about a specific use case that I have for the Luna Display. I've got the mini DisplayPort version plugged into a headless Mac Mini that I use as a Plex server. So if I'm sitting down on my couch on the first floor of my house to watch a movie with my family and something's wrong with the Mac, maybe it shut down or it needs to be restarted or whatever it happens to be, I don't have to go downstairs into the basement, plug in a display, find a keyboard, do all that, and get it all up and running again. I can just pull out my iPad and fix whatever the problem happens to be from right there on my couch without getting up. I love that. Okay, I have a special deal for Dialogue listeners. You can get 10% off of a Luna Display when you go to lunadisplay.com and enter the promo code DIALOGUE at checkout. That's DIALOG at checkout. Again, you'll get 10% off if you go to lunadisplay.com and use the promo code DIALOGUE at checkout. I'll put a link in the show notes too. Our thanks to Luna Display for their support of Dialogue. We also, though, are living in an era where I think big media companies especially are really suffering right now. I mean, we've seen lots of layoffs from big, online media sites, and it feels like there are fewer new sites trying to be the next Daring Fireball or Mac Stories or whatever it happens to be. I mean, what do you think's going on there? Is it just the transition to video? Is it something else?
I don't know, but I was very wrong about it because, like, in those early days when I first, 2004 was when I first started trying to make money, and I still had it was the last job I ever had for somebody else. I worked for a startup called Joyent until 2006, and I quit Joyent specifically with the theory that the revenue at Daring Fireball was never going to grow to the point where it could be my full-time job until after I started treating it as my full-time job. And I think in hindsight, I was right. And I had money saved up that I could do it. And that's when and did another t-shirt sale. And at the time did the t-shirts in the most cost efficient way possible, where I printed them locally here in Philadelphia. And my wife, I say my wife and I, but most of them, my wife stuffed them, folded them all and put them in envelopes. And I drove them all to the post office in a little tiny Subaru Impreza, well, not even a hatchback, so I could only fit a few boxes at a time. And then went to the post office and was like the guy at the post office you did not want to be behind in line. No. I mean, it was incredibly painstaking, but it was important for us to really, maximize our profit margins at that time. I thought, though, at the time that the advantage that I had and Jason Kotke had, Heather Armstrong, who wrote Deuce.com, DOOCE, who I consider a peer from the time, and her site started a little earlier, same year, 2002 as mine. But she was a web designer in Los Angeles at the time, and her husband was a little bit more of she was a web designer. He was a little bit more, technically savvy enough to know how to get movable type installed and running and completely customized so that her site looked completely like Deuce.com and nothing like a movable type default template. I thought the advantage that her and me and Kotke and a few others in the early era, Dave Weiner, of course, has written all of the software that drives scripting.com over the years. The advantage we had is that we knew how to write our own websites and we knew how to make them work. And I thought it was inevitable that something like, say, Tumblr would come about. Tumblr, not the exact nature of Tumblr, and there's a certain social aspect to Tumblr that I didn't foresee. The ability that you can just go to WordPress.com and sign up for a website with no technical knowledge at all. You don't have to know anything about HTML or CSS. There's a whole bunch of ways to do it. I thought it was inevitable that you'd be able to do that people, and they'd be able to really brand their sites. They wouldn't look like cookie cutter templates. And that once that happened, I really thought that was sort of the path forward for people who wanted to be independent writers on the web. Right. Much in the way that, if you're a professional novelist, you don't go to work for a corporation, right? You don't go to a novel writing company and write. Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I thought that the fact that to be what I always consider myself as a columnist, but to be a columnist, you had to have a gig at a publication, and the publications were sort of corporate in a way, whether it was a Sports Illustrated or the Philadelphia Inquirer or the New York Times or the Economist or whatever. I really thought the future for that type of writing was more like being a novelist, where you could do it on your own, whatever your field, right? Whether it was politics or cooking and food or any area of interest where people there's an audience of people to read. I really thought the future was more like being a novelist, where you can do it out of your house on your own, under your own umbrella. I really thought that the only advantage that we pioneers had was that we were the people who knew the technical nature to get a website off the ground at a time when you kind of had to be a web nerd to do it. And I was right that the future was that non-technical people would be able to start their own website without knowing any code whatsoever. But I was completely wrong that there was any sort of future in that as a way for writers to make a business. And that depresses me, because I think that if somehow that had worked, I think we'd be in a much better place. I think it's a very depressing world to be in now, to want to be a writer, because the value of writing has dropped so precipitously because of the proliferation of people willing to write for free and very poorly.
Definitely.
It gets me sad. One thing that makes me sad, I don't know if do you guys watch the Game of Thrones?
I don't.
Well,
I do.
But one of when a show gets super popular, and Game of Thrones has got to be the canonical example of this. There are I honestly, I'm going to say 100, but maybe there's more. But there's 100 people getting paid probably way too little to write episode synopsises, where they just sort of recap the episode. And even the New Yorker has a Game of Thrones synopsis. And, the better the writer, and, the ones at the New Yorker are better written, they do more than just tell you what happened. They offer some kind of insight, and it's more engaging to read, and maybe more knowledgeable about tying it in, and maybe making some connections to remember this thing from 3 years ago. Oh, I didn't even, I watched the episode, I'll read the thing. But it's sad to me that so many people are wasting their time writing episode synopsises of TV shows. But somehow that's something people read, and now people get paid like $100 to spend a couple hours watching and writing about TV episodes. It's crazy to me.
It is crazy. And it kind of goes to something that really I'm conflicted on when I look at something like Apple News Plus, which is, on the one hand, Apple is saying that they are promoting, publishers and writers and good news. On the other hand, a service like that really kind of commoditizes writings because, you've decoupled the writers from the publication.
Yeah.
There's no longer necessarily a publication voice, and the byline is, bylines have never been a priority at Apple. I mean, we know that just from looking at the App Store, right? I mean, where do you think Apple's going with that kind of thing?
I don't know, but the Apple culture of not giving credit to anybody but the very top executives in the modern Apple era, which I personally define as the 1997 onward when they reunified with Next and Steve Jobs and his crew came back. I mean, in the old days, and I feel like we lost something. In the old days, when you'd go to any Apple application, written by Apple, you could go to about this app and it would give you an about box that actually told you the names of the people who made it. Right? Like, I honestly almost wonder why the hell we even have about boxes anymore, at least in Apple software, because they don't tell you anything other than it's copyright 2019 Apple.
The version number, right?
Right. It's a version number and a copyright statement, and there's nothing else there, whereas it used to give you credit. On the flip side, my son just went to see the Avengers Endgame, and I dropped him off. It was with a bunch of friends, and dropped him off and told him I'd come pick him up. And I said, just text me the second the movie starts, and then I'll figure out from the length of the movie when to pick you up. And then I went and looked at the last Avengers movie. The runtime of this new one is it's like 181 minutes. So it's almost exactly to the minute, 3 hours. But I figured the credits are long. I went to the last Avengers movie on Apple TV and figured out how long the credits were, and it was 13 minutes. It's 13 minutes of credits.
Wow.
And I think that one of the Lords of the Rings movies might have the record still. It's, but it's just crazy. And I'm not trying to denigrate the people who provide food services to the movie crew or something like that. But when you watch like an old movie from like the 60s or 70s, like the credits were really for the people who made the movie, and they're like 45 seconds long, and it tells you the people who really made the movie. I think Hollywood in its all union rules, and I'm a pro-union guy, but I feel like the mandating that the guy who brings the sandwiches to the set gets a credit is a bit over the top. But anyway. But it makes the credits. I feel like fewer and fewer people than ever watch the credits. I think it was great when Apple gave credit to just the handful of people who really made apps, and Steve Jobs eliminated that practice under the premise that he was concerned that people were using the about box to poach employees. That they'd look at a good Apple app, go to the about box, and then they'd get inundated. I think that's kind of BS because I don't think the good hiring managers in Silicon Valley need the about box. They know who to go after, right? And
sure.
And certainly in the modern day with LinkedIn and everything like that, that excuse certainly doesn't hold up in today's world. I think it's a somewhat disappointing culture. I don't think it's a huge deal, but I still feel like it's disappointing that Apple doesn't give credit to people. And I agree. I get it. It's a hard line to draw because why don't the people who make the actual hardware get it a credit? There's no about box for the MacBook Pro. So I get it that it's hard to draw a line, but that culture doesn't work well in the world of publishing. Like I think it's a much bigger deal that the App Store feature stories, which are good. The App Store has turned into,
yeah, they're absolutely good.
It has turned into an excellent publication. And we know in our world that an awful lot of very talented people have gone to work at Apple, in the post print demise of Macworld. Just one magazine, a tremendous amount of editorial talent that previously was full-time employed at Macworld for a long time are now full-time Apple employees who no longer write anything under their own byline. It's a bit depressing, in my opinion.
It is. They just kind of disappear into the black hole. And I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that Apple does not, I think, embrace the web very well. I mean, there are a lot of things that I know Federico and I have talked about over the years about why shouldn't you be able to buy an app on the web and have it just show up on your phone and that kind of thing?
Like the way you you can do that with Kindle stuff with Amazon.
Exactly, or you can do it with your PS4, your Nintendo Switch, or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That kind of thing just doesn't exist in the Apple ecosystem, and it feels like you're behind. There's this wall, and the wall is you'll come to Apple to get your stuff and figure and to read the editorial content. But that stuff, I think you mentioned it on your site recently.
Many times.
Trying to linking to editorial content on the App Store is terrible because someone has to be on an iOS device.
I feel really bad about it. It makes me very reluctant to do it. And I almost don't blame them. Well, I would prefer if they just had this stuff on a website and everybody could view it in their web browser of choice, just the same articles with with a button to click if they want to jump to the App Store. But I would allow them if I could bend Phil Schiller's ear and convince him to do it right. I could concede that if you are on a device with the modern App Store, meaning running like the last 2 versions of iOS or the last, Mojave for Mac, that if you hit one of these URLs, it will always and only open in the App Store app. But that if you're on any other device, an older iOS or older Mac or a Windows machine or a Chrome machine or, of course, Android, it'll just open in a web browser at some sort of appstore.apple.com address. It feels wrong to me. It feels wrong to me to link to any of that stuff from Daring Fireball, even though I do occasionally. But I would link to that stuff more often if it weren't. Every single time I do, though, I feel guilty because it feels wrong to me.
Yeah, no, it has to be. I mean, I know from my standpoint, I have to really, it has to be something very important for me to feel like I'm going to link to it, because I just know that people are going to tap on that link, and there's a certain percentage of people who just aren't going to be able to read it.
Right. Apple News, at least, Apple News is a better example, because Apple News will open in Apple News if you have Apple News, but if you're on any machine, Apple or otherwise, that doesn't have the Apple News app, the Apple News URL will redirect to the original URL, like at WashingtonPost.com or MacStories.net or whatever,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So switching topics a little bit here. Talking about the writing process for Daring Fireball. Here's something that you wrote in 2003. What I'm going for here isn't so much to be entertaining or even informative, but to be engaging. Is that still something that you try to hit every day with the F? Yeah,
that's a good way to put it. If I do say so myself, I don't really. That's long enough ago.
Who wrote that?
Yeah, you know what? I'll say about that sentence is it fits with another recurring theme of mine that maybe I don't hit hard enough, and I don't think I had really come upon in 2003, which is that I don't think we overall as a culture appreciate enough. Everybody gets that your top priorities matter, whether you're a person or a publication, whatever. The priorities of your individual or group effort matter. But I think it's vastly underestimated how important the order of your priorities are. That if you want your website to be engaging, informative, and entertaining, it matters which order you put those three adjectives, and you'll come out with a very different website depending on which is 1, 2, and 3. Informative would lead you, if it was your very top priority, would lead you to try to be more comprehensive and cover all the Mac news, right? Or Apple news, which Daring Fireball has never done. So I would probably say that for me, it's engaging, entertaining, and then informative in 1, 2, 3. And I think that matters. And engaging to me is maybe the hardest to describe, but it's the one that means, like, to me, I want to write in a way that people know I'm not going to waste their time. That's one of the top priorities I've had since day one at Daring Fireball, is that if you like what I write at Daring Fireball, this could be a place where you come once a day. And I'm a news junkie. Like I said, I used to read the newspaper at work. And I read the web all day, and I've carved out this idea where I can literally justify reading the web for half the day as quote unquote work. But in my mind, I know that a lot of the people who are big Daring Fireball readers are busy. They have other stuff to do. They're programmers or engineers of some other sort, and they have work that they need to sort of have long stretches of uninterrupted time. They're not reading the web all day. And maybe they, do 6 hours of nonstop concentrated work, and then they want to take a break. And I like the idea that they can start typing D in their location bar. It autofills Daring Fireball. They hit return. Yeah. And right on the homepage, they just can scroll right down. And if they see stuff of interest, they can open it in new tabs, but they can catch up on everything I wrote in one page view on the homepage with a couple of space bars to scroll down the page, and then feel like they don't have to come back till the next day. But also to be engaging, the fact that they can read it in a concentrated fashion. They don't have to skim. They can just start by paying attention and trust that their attention will be rewarded.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by Working Copy. Working Copy is an amazing Git client for iOS. The app puts Git repositories on your iOS devices so you can take them with you wherever you go. Not only do you get a full-fledged Git app, but with the document picker, you can access your repos from other apps. For example, we use Working Copy to collaboratively edit Markdown files at MacStories. I can edit files in my repo with Working Copy or use another text editor that supports document pickers to edit them in place without exporting or duplicating. Everything you would expect is here. There's cloning from GitHub and other hosting providers, or even your own Git server, editing with syntax highlighting for more than 50 languages, committing and pushing. But here's the thing. Working Copy is not some stripped-down implementation of Git. It's got a ton of advanced features. There's merging and rebasing to get changes from others. You can open pull requests on GitHub and GitLab too. On top of that, you can preview Markdown, HTML, and Jupyter Notebook files with external screen support and full text search inside of the repo. You can inspect differences made in text files and images, access files and commit right from within the Files app. And other apps can open repositories and make edits in place. There's even Git LFS support for working with huge image, audio, and video files. Working Copy is free to download and try so you can see if you like it. If you do, there's an in-app purchase to unlock its advanced features. Go to workingcopy.app to learn more and download the app today. Again, that's workingcopy.app to learn more about this remarkable Git client for iOS that works and integrates exceptionally well with other apps. Our thanks to Working Copy for supporting Dialogue.
This balance between going to DF and seeing link posts and then seeing also your own comments, I feel like a few years ago, you used to do more long form columns, and whereas now DF seems more to be, it's mostly the link list and your comments, and then the occasional, full blown DF story with the Unicode star in the title. How do you balance that, in terms of? I don't want to say inspiration because that's a bloated concept, but like how. What do you think constitutes DF content, and how do you balance that, having 10 links and then saying, no, I also want to write my story now? And also, that would be my additional question. What's it like when sometimes a post starts as a link post and then it becomes its own thing?
Like I change it.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. It's a gut feeling. I mean, do I write fewer feature articles? I write fewer massive ones, right? There's definitely a decrease in multi-thousand word ones. That is not a deliberate choice. Is it laziness? I don't know. I worry about that, that it is laziness, but I also don't feel like I'm holding back too much on such pieces. Like maybe it's just age. Maybe at age 46, I'm less capable of it than I was at age 36. I don't know. But I don't think there was a stretch longer ago. I'm looking at the archive list of all of the feature articles, for lack of a better term. There was a stretch more years ago, like looking at 2017, there were only 2 in October, 2 in November. September, though, was very busy. Sometimes I just scroll through the list and look at each month, and I like to see 5 or 6, and when I see only 2 or 3, I worry, unless one of them looks like it was really long. But it's really just a gut feeling. I either have the itch to write it or not. But then the other thing, too, is that the longer I go without writing something that I feel is truly substantial, I get just a nagging sense in my mind that I need to, and it's irresistible, and I have to do it. I don't have a boss, but there's a boss in the lower part of the back of my brain that forces me to do it, just to prove that I can, if for no other reason. But otherwise, I just sort of play it by ear. And then every once in a while, like you'll say, I'll start one that I think is a linkless post. And I don't have a word limit on how much of my own commentary I add to it. But sometimes I look at it and I feel like, you know what, this is more substantial and this is more my take than their take. So I should flip the switch and do it. And that's unfortunately it's not hard, but it isn't like clicking a checkbox. I actually have to delete the entry into one blog and recreate it in a new one, and then add something to my Apache redirect file so that the old URL doesn't break and it'll go to the new one. But it's very hard to explain, Federico. It's a gut feeling more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think it is true that maybe it was a better way to put it would be the super long feature stories. Like, I remember your OmniWeb review from many, many years ago, and your developer interviews. Like, those used to be very long. I think the Brent Simmons one was probably 15,000, 20,000 words, something like that. It was massive.
Well, those have been replaced by podcasts, and they were good. I do love those articles, and I think they stand up. And I wish, and I still, it's among the top of my like things I need to solve and maybe could share with the rest of the industry is I feel like I need to solve the transcript problem for podcasts. Like, I feel like my podcast should all have really good transcripts for searchability and honestly for accessibility for people who, it's clearly a podcast with a full transcript is more accessible, both for people who have obviously if you have hearing problems, that's the biggest, but there's, accessibility, is another of my recurring themes. Accessibility helps people who don't even have handicaps.
Right.
Just the fact that it's Google searchable, that if my podcast archive were completely had text transcripts, it would be Google searchable, DuckDuckGo searchable. That's accessibility. That, being searchable on the web is accessible. I can't tell you how many times me personally want to figure out what the hell episode did I talk about this on, and I have no idea how to figure it out.
Right. And you might end up just going back and listening to 2 or 3 different episodes, and that's an incredibly inefficient way of doing that.
Right. No, I don't do it. I just give up. I almost never listen to my own show. I have listened to extraordinarily few minutes of my show. I can't stand it. I don't edit my show. Never have, and I don't have it. Once I finish recording an episode, I'm like repulsed by it. As opposed, and that's one way that me as a podcaster is very different than me as a writer. Is I do edit my own articles and read and reread, and the longer it is, the more times I reread it. I have no problem reading my own writing, but I have a complete aversion to listening to my own podcasting. I will not be listening to this episode.
I understand that, although you do get used to it. I mean, I probably listen to an episode of App Stories 3 times before it actually comes out, since I'm doing all the production stuff. So it's hard at first, but it's like anything. It's just like editing your own writing. You eventually get used to it.
No, I never listen back either. I just hate the accent. It's just I cannot stand it. So, do you have an external somebody else that helps you with editing your stories on DF, or is it just you?
In a structural sense, it's only me in terms of actually reorganizing an article. Although I don't, I don't tend to do much of that. I feel like my stuff and maybe I'm fooling myself, but I feel like even on a long article, I write fairly slowly. And I've always said, and people who listen to my show or even to this show will say I probably talk slowly. There's an awful lot of people who probably, like, maybe the best thing that ever happened to my podcast is the invention of the smart speed controls in apps like Overcast that speed it up. And an awful lot of people have said, I can finally start listening to your show because now you talk at a regular rate. I'm a slow thinker, and I learned to type only as fast as I can think, which is not that fast. I never feel like I'm hamstrung, like keeping up with my thoughts while typing, but it's not very fast. And so, like, I've never done the whole live blog thing for Apple events and never could. Like, I've sat next to Jason Snell, who is a tremendously fast typist. I mean, like,
he's a machine.
he could seriously, I think well, maybe not, because in today's world, I'm sure that the actual competitive typing is absurd. But certainly amongst writers, he could certainly win a contest on typing. But everybody types faster than me. I sit next to a whole bunch of people. Most of the people who go to those events do some sort of live blog coverage, and a lot of times I get distracted for a second and think, "Oh my God, how fast they type! I can't do it." So part of me being a slow thinker is that I feel like I'm naturally able to organize my thoughts, even in a long, complicated argument, in a natural way. So I don't do much editing typically of that nature, but sometimes I do, or sometimes I'll cross out a whole section. Doesn't happen often that I'll waste hundreds and hundreds of words on something and then, like, sleep on it, wake up the next day, read it again, and think, you know what, this whole thing is distracting. Throw it out. But it happens. But I do all that myself at a copy editing level of fixing typos and mistakes and maybe rewording a sentence for clarity if it's misleading. It's all on a volunteer basis. But there's a handful of longtime DF readers who like the graph of the number of typos I've fixed from reports from specific people. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people on Twitter and email who've sent me like one or two. And then there's like 3 or 4 people who've sent me thousands themselves. And I'm forever in their debt because they do it at a completely volunteer level.
Yeah. Do you feel like you still rely on the DF audience much to discover interesting links to link? Or do you feel like maybe you do more that yourself? You just, browse the web and check Twitter and RSS and you discover stuff?
That's hard to say. Twitter has certainly changed it tremendously. It's really hard to imagine the pre-Twitter world in terms of discovering content. But I do get lots of tips. My @ replies on Twitter, which are specifically somebody finds something and just sends it to me, tags me in it. It's still a surprising amount of content. It's hard to say. I would Daring Fireball would be worse if people stopped sending me suggestions. I don't know if I'm dependent on it, but it certainly every week there's a couple of items that I definitely would not have found on my own that come from readers, and I appreciate it tremendously.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel any because with the talk show, do you feel any kind of I don't want to say tension, but maybe you need something that you need to think about. Maybe you have an idea, or maybe you have an opinion or a thought, and you decide, I want to talk about this on the show. Or maybe you're like, no, I want to save this for DF.
That's a very astute question, Federico, and I think you're right. And I do think it coincides a bit. I should have thought of that, and I didn't think about it till you just asked. But I do think the rise of the talk show is something that I do and consider part of my job, coincides with the decrease in really long articles. And it's not so much because I think, well, I'll just do it on the podcast. It's the fact that I have to do at least 3 podcasts a month, more or less. One of the weird things about my show is it does not have a regular publication schedule, but as close to
really
as close to a regular publication schedule as it has is just to satisfy advertisers who've been sold in advance is roughly 3 a month.
Right.
And so I have to do 3 a month, and I do them. And by only doing 3, there's often a lot to talk about. And then once I've talked about it and feel like I did a good job.
Yeah, once you've talked about the issues on the talk show, you're probably at that point it gets it out of your system, I suppose.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And if money weren't a factor, if I were independently wealthy, if I had enough money that I didn't need to do Daring Fireball as a business, I would do a lot fewer podcasts and a lot more writing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's interesting to me is that you define yourself first as a writer, because I mean, I know I feel that way, and I think Federico, you probably feel the same thing. Although all three of us are doing quite a bit of podcasting and other things to just kind of make ends meet. But at the core of it, I mean, I think writing is still the most important thing for us, as I think it is for Daring Fireball as well. So, John, let me ask you this. What role today do Apple sources play in your writing?
Sources who work at Apple?
Yes.
Not much. A little. Less than they did in the past, just because it's always been such a small number that random variation in people leaving jobs, et cetera, would affect it greatly. Like I don't learn as much advanced stuff as I used to, just because certain people who would tip me to things are no longer there or in different positions or something like that. And partially I lost interest in writing that sort of stuff too. So not a lot, but sometimes it is just such a deep background, It is just sort of, oh, I get it. Yeah. But it's not really something I can even attribute to a quote unquote little birdie. It's just something that I can know going forward.
Yeah.
Writing kind of informs your writing going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also if you consider how the entire sort of Apple rumor scene has changed in the past couple of years, and now basically most of the rumors that we get are based on things that are discovered in software. They're not necessarily leaks per se, like coming from sources. I feel like there's been so many changes in that kind of industry in the past few years that I think I wouldn't want to play that game either. It just seems not worth it maybe at this point. I don't know. But it definitely feels different from, say, 5-6 years ago when German was a 9-to-5 Mac, for example.
Well, it's still fascinating to me that it's down to like two people, right? It's Gurman still gets stuff, and now Guy Rambo has gotten an avalanche of stuff. But it's really gotten to the point where there's almost, I mean, who else even really has had a good Apple rumor in recent years? It's almost remarkable that how they've almost closed all the leaks, but even with just like two little holes, a lot of stuff still leaks out.
Yeah, that's true. So, John, we've talked about your first experiences as a writer, the beginnings of Daring Fireball, the different business models, sort of how you approach writing for DF and what constitutes DF content, so to speak. Where does DF go from here? Besides I assume just by talking to you and sort of in a way knowing you from your work, that you strike me as one of those people who are just going to do this until they can, even if you're 70. Like just keep writing until you want to. But I just wonder if there's any other, maybe not necessarily a plan, but maybe some goal that you're still hoping to achieve.
That's a good one. I don't know.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like my days of massive innovation are over. I mean, like I said, something on YouTube is a possibility. I don't have any concrete ideas. This is, it's the only thing I can think of that it's even on my radar as something that would be an expansion. But I feel like what I do at Daring Fireball still works every bit as well as it ever did. I feel like the podcast has settled into what it naturally should be and what people seem to like most. And I don't have any other ideas. I mean,
no, that's a beautiful answer. Actually, just keep doing that, until you want to. I think that's a perfect, valid answer. Sometimes people just say, "Oh, I want to do this and I want to do that," and then they don't do it. And then it just looks bad. So consistency, I guess. That would be the answer.
John, I want to really thank you for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you about Daring Fireball, the talk show, and everything else. I mean, we all have a big.
We didn't even talk about Markdown.
Oh man, I didn't mention Markdown. Is there? Yes. Okay. So, hold on.
All right, Federico is gonna revive this podcast with one more question.
Yeah, just one more. So, because this is something that I've been meaning to ask. So obviously we all use Markdown here. But what really intrigues me about Markdown is just how pure it is. Years ago, I was, 5 years ago, I was in the camp of people who would say, why does not John add stuff to Markdown? Why does he not have more features? And that was when the whole, actually maybe more than 5 years ago, in the 2010, 2011 era, when, Justin Williams came up with Elements, the text editor with Dropboxing. And I would wonder, why does not John add, native, footnotes or, these other syntax elements to Markdown? But then I guess over time, I've come to appreciate the purity of the idea of Markdown, that it is what it is. So I sort of wonder if you're still in a way struggling with enhancing Markdown, or if maybe at this point the simplicity and the purity of Markdown is what defines Markdown.
I say, there was a controversy like you're alluding to that it bubbled up before, but I don't know. I don't even know what year it was. It seems like it was a long time ago, 2010, 2011. Seems like, I don't know. There was a certain point where, Markdown, I think I first announced it in 2004. I think it was in beta for quote unquote beta for that year. And then it came out of beta at the end of the year. And I've left it, my official version, unchanged since then, other than small bug fixes. But I haven't even fixed a bug in like 10 years. And my explanation for that, and then for a handful of years, I've told this story before. At first, I thought I really was convinced that I had something. I was like, this is super great. And the late Aaron Swartz, who helped me with it, he was sort of my muse. Like he doesn't, I'm taking nothing away from him, and God, do I miss him. He doesn't deserve credit for co-creating it. He was definitely not the co-creator, but he was like the one beta tester who got it. Like when I first came up with it, I invited a couple people to help beta test it with me, and none of them really got it. Like the basic reception in that era was, why not just write HTML? Just put the P tags around your paragraphs. Like, who cares why put stars around italicized text rather than I tags? And Aaron got it. He got it right away. Like whatever it is that is the thing that makes people love Markdown, Aaron got it while it was still half gestated, and really helped clarify some of the decisions going forward. And then I really thought I had it. Aaron was very excited about it. And his excitement about it is what, like, for a while, he was like a Wikipedia page for Markdown, like co-credited him as a creator. And I think that in hindsight, the reason why it wasn't because he took credit. It was because he spent more time publicizing it, like going to places like Boing Boing and other places and trying to get people to, when it first came out, getting them excited about it. That those early pages about it had mentioned that, that Aaron Swartz told them about it, and somehow that got misinterpreted as co-creating it. And that's neither here nor there, I guess. But then it came out and it didn't really go anywhere. And I thought that was so disappointing. I was like, I'm convinced that this is great, and it just doesn't seem to have any upswing. And then, slowly but surely, way slower than like Daring Fireball's takeoff from starting to becoming quote unquote popular. It did become popular. And then people started adjusting it to suit their needs of the context they were using it. And there were different versions of Markdown. And I never was bothered by that. Only sometimes by the names people chose. Like I didn't want anybody to choose a name that made it seem like it was the Markdown. Like the best example is Michel Fortin's I don't know if that's the right way to pronounce his first name, but his PHP Markdown. PHP Markdown is a very, very faithful PHP implementation of my Perl implementation of Markdown. And then he created PHP Markdown Extras, which has support for things that my Markdown doesn't support, like footnotes and tables. And the name PHP Markdown Extras is perfect. It's PHP Markdown implemented technically in PHP with extras. That's great. Very clear. And the way, once it became super popular and once it became clear that people were adjusting it to suit their needs, like the fact that in real Markdown, you're allowed to use any HTML tag you want anywhere, whether it's because you want to use the HTML tag or because you're doing something that Markdown's own syntax doesn't support. And you don't have to switch modes. It's not like you type something to get into HTML mode. You just stick the HTML tag where you want it. Well, in certain contexts, that's incredibly inappropriate. You don't want commenters, if you're going to use Markdown for the syntax in your comments on a blog, you can't let people just put any HTML tag anywhere. Or if you do, it's going to have to strip them out in an HTML cleansing stage for security and reasons. And GitHub changed theirs in various ways that works better for them. I mean, one of the things that people sort of get confused by is that to add an actual line break in the middle of a paragraph in real Markdown, you have to put 2 spaces at the end of the line and then hit return. Possibly a mistake in the original spec, just because 2 spaces are invisible and people get confused by it and they expect if they just hit a hard return, they'll get a return. But there's good reasons why a hard return doesn't do that. It's so that you can paste in a paragraph that looks like a paragraph, but happens to have a hard returns, but not have these weird line breaks all over the place. But GitHub, for their purposes, wants a return to be a line break, and they did it. And so they have GitHub flavored Markdown, which again, perfectly named. So my take on that is that this is fine, because Markdown ultimately is more of an idea than a spec or a single implementation. It's an idea. And the idea has huge legs, and the idea with slight tweaks works in certain places with those tweaks better than others. And there is no one set of rules that would make everybody happy, right? The controversy comes from people, engineers, who are at a philosophical level object to the idea that there's a famous XCKD comic like, hey, there's 14 competing standards in this area. You guys know the comic, right? Let's come up with one universal one that unifies everything, and we'll solve this because 14 standards is a mess. And then in the conclusion is now there's 15 competing standards. That's exactly that. I know there's an XKCD for everything, but that XKCD is long story short, that is why there is no one universal Markdown for everybody, because there never could be. There absolutely never could be one that would make everybody happy. And having it be more of an idea with certain fundamentals that stay the same everywhere is better in overall, because the universal format is that all Markdown emits HTML, and HTML is a super well-defined specification and standard. Yeah. And I think it's served it well. And the doom and gloom people, when this first became a controversy and they wanted to, create, the argument that I had done Markdown harm by not adding new things to it, or both two separate things, adding new features over time and working to unify it into one universal specification that everybody could use everywhere, that was doing harm to Markdown, and Markdown would ultimately fail in the long run because it would collapse upon itself because these are bad things. And my argument was, I don't think that's going to happen. I think the opposite's going to happen. And now that it's getting more popular, it'll continue getting more popular. And if anything, there'll be more variants, and that's fine. And everybody will just get it. Because the thing is you can just look at it, right? That's the thing, is that it's a very visual. The whole point of it is that you're supposed to be able to look at it and figure it out.
What is it about Markdown, John, do you think that caused it to eventually take off? Was it iOS and the fact that iOS is so simple?
No, I don't think it was iOS. I think I think it's a good idea. I don't know. Maybe is it iOS? I don't know. I don't think so, though.
I don't know. It felt like at one point, it felt like text editors on iOS had played a major role in it improving, getting adopted, only because rich text was just such a mess on iOS, and really still is, but maybe not. I mean, I guess it did take off before that. I
just think it's the fact that it is. I think it took off slowly because you really had to try it. You still do. You have to actually use it for a bit compared to any other way of writing for online writing. before you, and not even just online writing. Right now, there are variants. They don't even call them Markdown because they're so different. But that's right. There's people who've written screenplay software. There's the Fountain format that is used by one, and I forget the other one, but they use a Markdown-like format for screenplay formatting. So it's not even online writing, but it's just a convenient way to write. And it's so nice to have everything be a visual marker, right? Like I always say, like one of the things is like in a WYSIWYG editor, and there's still a role for WYSIWYG editors like Pages and Microsoft Word and everything. But like if there's an italicized word in the middle of a paragraph and you put your insertion point at the end of that italicized word and the next word is not italicized and you start typing, is that word going to be italicized? Are you in the italicized zone or the non-italicized zone?
Yeah.
Whereas in Markdown, you never have to worry about that because you're either inside the asterisk or the underscore, whichever one you use, or you're outside it, and you know.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
But I really think the appeal of it, people don't get the appeal of it when you describe it to them. I've never been able to my own, and that's why I think it took off slowly, and I was disappointed. I thought I did such a good job of describing it, but I really felt like it took uptick of more systems, whether they were blogging systems or any other system, to say, okay, you can use Markdown for writing here. And then once people tried it, they were like, oh my God, this is so great. This is exactly what I want.
Yeah, I get that. It took a long time for it to click with me too. And I think a lot of it has to do with whether you write online too, right? I mean, if you don't deal with HTML, you wonder why this is something that is different or should be different than just using a word processor, which to me is a whole different animal than a text editor.
Right. Every other way of writing online is either WYSIWYG, which has never really taken off, right? I know like WordPress has a WYSIWYG editor, but it's never really taken off. And the WYSIWYG editors always end up adding, you never quite know what you're going to get as the output. If there's going to be weird, like indentation that's done by 7 non-breaking spaces in a row, as opposed to properly using some kind of thing to do the indentation, a tag to do the indentation.
There's nothing like looking at the actual HTML after you use a WYSIWYG.
Right. And there's I think it would be very hard to top it as a way, to write in plain text.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. All right, John, I want to thank you a second time for joining us on Dialogue today.
This is the real conclusion.
Are there any questions we haven't asked you that we should ask you, John?
Markdown. I just couldn't believe that we weren't going to talk about Markdown.
No, that is completely on us.
And I will say it is a huge thrill to me personally now. And it is so bizarre that I spent years worried that it wasn't popular enough, and now it's everywhere, and it is extraordinarily pleasing to me.
Yeah, no, it is amazing, and look, we're in it every single day.
If we could only get those bastards at Slack to change italics to be
oh my
asterisks.
God, I hate that so much.
Yeah, it drives me crazy.
Freaking bastards. Like there's some guy in the early days of Slack who didn't like Markdown and did it a different way, and now we're stuck with it forever. Yeah, freaking bastards.
All right.
Anyway.
Well, thanks for joining us, John. I really appreciate it.
It was a true pleasure talking to you, and it's an honor to be on the first episode. True honor.
I want to thank our 2 sponsors again, Lunar Display and Working Copy. And next week, we'll be back with an all-new episode featuring songwriter Frank Turner. So see you next week.
Ciao, John.